welcome back to whispers in the dark. Settle in close, lower the lights, and listen carefully, because this is not a gentle fairy tale meant to soothe the heart before sleep. This is one of the darkest stories ever gathered, a tale rooted in grief, envy, blood, and a love that somehow survives even after the body has been cut apart and served steaming at a family table. This is the story of the Juniper Tree. Now let's begin. Long ago, in a place where winter winds pressed cold fingers against the windows, and old houses stood with their dark beams creaking in the night, there lived a rich man and his wife. Their home was large and sturdy, with low ceilings of dark oak, stone floors that held the chill of every season, and a courtyard whose silence seemed deeper than the silence of other homes. Behind the house stood a juniper tree. It was an old tree, older than the house, older perhaps than the line of people who had lived there. Its trunk was broad and rough, dark as smoked wood, and its bark peeled in thin curled strips like old skin. In summer, it gave off a bitter fragrance that was sharp and green and strangely sweet beneath it. In winter, the branches held themselves stiff against the sky, heavy with frost, and the red berries clung there like drops of blood that refused to freeze. Even in daylight, the place beneath its boughs seemed dim. The air under it was always cooler, always stiller, as though the world paused there to listen. The man and his wife had everything that wealth could buy, yet they had no child. And because they had no child, all the rooms in the house seemed too large, all the silence too complete. The wife often sat beneath the juniper tree in winter, wrapped in a thick wool cloak, gazing at the white snow spread smooth over the earth. The snow lay so pure it seemed untouched by the world, a shining blanket over the roots of the dark tree. One day, when the sky was pale and the cold had sharpened everything into stillness, the wife stood beneath the juniper and peeled an apple with a small knife. The fruit was red and glossy in her hand, and as she worked, her thoughts grew heavy with longing. She looked at the snow and sighed. Her breath drifted in a white cloud before her face. "If only I had a child as white as snow," she murmured. She kept peeling. The blade slipped. It cut into her finger. Only a small wound, yet the blood welled up at once, bright and sudden, and impossibly red against the skin. 3 drops fell from her hand and landed in the snow beneath the juniper tree. She stared at them. They seemed so vivid, so beautiful, so alive against the white. Something in her heart opened then, some aching place full of hunger and hope and sorrow. "If only I had a child as red as blood and as white as snow." The words drifted out into the cold air. No one answered. Yet the branches above her gave the faintest whisper, though no wind moved them. A month passed, and the snow melted. 2 months passed, and the earth beneath the tree grew green. 3 months passed, and the first small leaves unfurled. 4 months passed, and the woman felt a strange happiness stirring in her body. 5 months passed, and the blossoms bloomed white across the orchards. 6 months passed, and the fruit ripened. 7 months passed, and she grew heavy with child. And sometimes, in the late evening, she would rest her hand over her belly and listen to the creak of the old house and the hush of the juniper outside. And she would feel that whatever had heard her wish beneath the tree had not forgotten. 8 months passed, and she gathered the berries of the juniper with trembling hands and ate them, finding in their sharp flavor something both bitter and sweet, something almost like tears. 9 months passed, and she gave birth to a son. He was indeed as white as snow and as red as blood. But the moment she looked upon him, all the joy drained from her face. It was as though fulfillment had cost more than she knew. Her skin turned pale as linen washed too many times. A terrible stillness came over her. She called her husband to her bedside and said, in a voice grown very weak, that if she died, he must bury her beneath the juniper tree. Then she closed her eyes and died. There are griefs that wail and tear at the walls. There are griefs that fall silent. This man's grief was the silent kind. He buried his wife beneath the juniper tree as she had asked. The soil was damp and black. The roots were thick and twisted. When the earth fell on the coffin lid, the dull thuds sounded like someone knocking from very far away. Time passed, though not kindly. The man mourned deeply, then less deeply, then with a numb ache that settled into his bones. His son grew in the house where his mother's absence lingered like cold in a stone corridor. At last, because life demands company and routine and the performance of normal things, the man married again. His second wife was beautiful in the way polished metal is beautiful. At first glance, she seemed composed and elegant, with dark hair coiled smooth upon her head, pale hands, and eyes that missed very little. But there was a hardness in her, a thin inward twist that grew worse when she bore a daughter of her own. That daughter was called Marlene. Little Marlene was lovely and gentle. Her hair shone the color of ripe wheat in summer light, and her face was soft and open. She had a quiet way of moving through the house, careful not to disturb anyone, with the kind of innocence that makes cruelty appear even more monstrous beside it. The second wife loved only her own child. Such love might have been simple and human had it not soured into comparison. For in the house there was the rich man's son, the first wife's child, the boy who had been wished into the world with blood on snow. Though he had no fault in him, though he was only a child, the sight of him sharpened the stepmother's resentment day by day. She began to think of inheritance. She began to think of bloodlines. She began to think, in the privacy of her mind, that everything in the house should belong to Marlene alone. Jealousy in an old fairy tale is never mild. It is never merely discontent. It is a rot. It works inward first, then outward. It sweetens its own poison. The woman began to look upon the boy as though he were a living obstacle placed in her path by a dead rival. Sometimes, when the father was away, she would speak sharply to the child for no reason. Sometimes she would send him from room to room on pointless errands just to watch his confusion. Sometimes she would seize him by the shoulder and shake him until his teeth clicked together, then release him as if nothing had happened. The boy learned to move quietly, to lower his eyes, to avoid the sound of her skirts in the corridor. Yet children cannot disappear completely. They breathe. They eat. They stand where adults can see them. And every glimpse of him inflamed her more. Marlene loved her brother in the innocent way children often do, without calculation, without fear of tomorrow. She would share with him what sweets she had, speak to him softly, and follow him in the garden. But the mother would see them together and feel her chest constrict with rage. One afternoon, when the sky had turned gray and close, and the house seemed full of a waiting gloom, the stepmother stood in the storeroom beside a wooden chest. It was a heavy chest used for apples, with a great lid that closed sharply under its own weight. The inside smelled of stored fruit, dry wood, and the faint sourness of old autumn. Light from the small window fell over the pile of red apples within, making them gleam like polished flesh. She had already decided what she would do. In old tales, murder begins in the heart before it begins in the hand. By the time the chance arrived, the deed was already alive inside her. She called for the boy. Her voice was sweet. He came at once, because children come when adults call them, especially when sweetness appears where cruelty usually lives. He stepped into the room, his face pale, his hair neat, his eyes uncertain. "My son," she said, and the false tenderness in the word was like silk laid over a knife. "Would you like an apple?" The boy looked at the apples and nodded. Perhaps he was hungry. Perhaps he was hopeful. Perhaps he simply forgot, for one brief dangerous moment, to be afraid. She lifted the lid. The smell of apples drifted up, rich and cold and full of sweetness. "Reach in and choose the finest one," she said. He bent forward over the chest, his neck exposed, his fair hair falling softly near the rim. Then she let the lid fall. It slammed down upon his neck with a crack so sudden and violent that the room itself seemed to jolt. For one impossible instant, there was silence. Then blood rushed across the apples below, warm and bright, slipping into the cracks between the fruit, dripping from the edge of the chest to the floor in thick red lines. The boy's head fell among the apples. His body remained standing for a moment, small and upright, because death can be grotesque before it is still. Then the body collapsed. The stepmother stared. Even she, who had wished for this, was seized by terror at what her own hands had done. Her face went white. Her lips trembled. She looked around the room as though the walls might accuse her. The blood smelled hot and metallic, filling the air so strongly that she pressed a hand to her mouth. But fear does not always bring repentance. Sometimes it merely brings cunning. She took up the head. Blood ran over her fingers and along her wrists. She placed it back upon the neck as neatly as she could. was too clean, too awful. She wrapped a white kerchief around the neck, tying it tight so the head would not slip away at once. Then she sat the dead boy on a chair by the door and placed an apple in his hand, making him seem as though he waited there in a sulk, chin lowered, silent. When little Marlene came home from school, the world outside still gray and damp around her, she entered the kitchen and found her mother by the hearth. "Marlene," said the mother, her voice now calm, "go to your brother and ask him to give you the apple." Marlene set down her things and went obediently to the door. Her brother sat there so still. The kerchief was tied around his neck. His face looked strangely pale, and his eyes did not meet hers. Yet children do not easily imagine death where they expect life. "Brother," Marlene said softly, "may I have the apple?" There was no answer. She asked again. Still no answer. She thought he must be angry with her. The stillness unsettled her. A cold little unease began to creep over her skin. "Mama," she called, "my brother will not answer me." "Go and ask him again," said the mother. So Marlene returned, more anxious now, and asked once more. Nothing. The room seemed too quiet. The boy did not blink. He did not breathe. Marlene felt tears gathering. "Mama, he frightens me. He will not speak." And the mother said, with perfect cruelty, "Then box his ears. Perhaps that will teach him to answer when you speak." Children trust the shape of authority, even when authority hides a pit beneath its words. Trembling, already half crying, Marlene raised her small hand and struck her brother on the side of the head. The head toppled off. It fell to the floor with a dull, sickening sound. The kerchief loosened. The severed neck gaped darkly. Blood, no longer pumping yet still wet, smeared over the wood. Marlene saw the truth all at once. She let out a cry so raw it seemed torn from the center of her little body. She dropped to her knees and gathered the head, sobbing in horror, while her whole frame shook with terror. The stepmother came at once, not to comfort, but to weaponize the child's innocence. "What have you done?" she hissed. Marlene could hardly breathe. Her face was flooded with tears. She stared at the head in her hands, unable even to understand how blame had been thrust upon her. Only that somehow her blow had brought this nightmare into the open. "Do not cry," said the mother, but there was no kindness in it. "What is done is done. We must be quiet now." And because terror can paralyze better than any chain, Marlene obeyed. The mother carried the boy's body to the kitchen. There, in the room where meals had always been prepared, where onions had been chopped, and bread kneaded, and broth simmered on cold mornings, she turned the body into food. It is one thing to say she cooked him. It is another to imagine the room. The fire in the hearth glowed red through its bed of coals. A black iron pot hung over it, steaming faintly. The air smelled of herbs, root vegetables, and the damp mineral scent of washed stone. The mother laid the small corpse on the table. The skin was white where the blood had left it. The limbs were limp. The head set aside, watched with glassy eyes. Then the knife came down, joints parted with little cracking pops. Flesh opened, blood darkened the boards, bone gleamed wetly where it was cut. The woman worked with cold determination, severing, slicing, reducing the child to pieces that could fit inside the pot. Steam rose when the meat touched the broth. Fat swirled on the surface. The smell changed slowly from horror to supper. Marlene stood in a corner and wept until her tears fell into the apron clutched at her face. She could not look and could not stop looking. The room seemed to tilt around her. Every familiar thing had become monstrous. The knife, the ladle, the wooden spoon, the pot, the fire. All of them had taken part in something no child should ever see. When the rich man came home at evening, tired from his affairs and hungry, as men often are at the end of a day, he sat at table and asked, "Where is my son?" The stepmother smiled faintly and said that the boy had gone across the country to visit relatives and would stay there for some time. The father seemed troubled, yet the smell from the pot was rich and savory, and the table had been laid. He sat. The stew was served. He ate with appetite, praising the flavor, saying it had never tasted so good. He asked for more. He leaned over the bowl and drank the broth. He sucked the marrow from the little bones and tossed them beneath the table without seeing. He wiped his mouth and asked for another helping, while beside him his daughter Marlene sat weeping so hard her plate blurred beneath her tears. She could not swallow. She could scarcely breathe. The father noticed her at last and asked why she cried. "Ah," said the mother smoothly, "she misses her brother who has gone away." So the father sighed and said it was a shame, yet the boy had wanted to visit kin and perhaps would be happy there. Then he ate again. The horror of that meal is not only in the flesh consumed. It is in the ignorance. It is in the domestic calm stretched over atrocity. It is in the ordinary clink of spoon against bowl, while a child's remains are chewed between a father's teeth. When supper was done, and the bones lay scattered beneath the table, Marlene knelt and gathered them one by one. Her hands shook. Some were slick with grease. Some were delicate as bird bones. She placed them carefully into her best silk handkerchief, the one she treasured most, because grief in a child often expresses itself through small acts of care when the world has become too terrible to understand. She tied the bundle close. Then she went out. Evening had deepened. The sky was blackening toward night. The juniper tree stood in the garden, its branches dark against the fatting light. The air beneath it smelled of resin and berries and cold earth. Marlene knelt at the foot of the tree, at the place where the first wife lay buried, and there she laid down the bundle of bones. The moment the handkerchief touched the earth, the juniper began to stir. At first it was only a whisper through the needles. Then the trunk shivered. Then every branch trembled, though the night air was still. A mist seemed to gather around the roots, pale and silver, coiling upward. The branches parted with a sigh like a long breath released after years of holding. The scent grew stronger, so strong it was almost dizzying, bitter and sweet and sharp as memory. Marlene stepped back in fear. Then there came a flash, not lightning from the sky, but a sudden burst from within the tree itself, as though something hidden in the wood had split open with light. Flame seemed to leap among the branches, not burning them, but crowning them. Out of the fire and smoke rose a bird. It was magnificent and dreadful. Its feathers shone red and green and gold. Its breast gleamed like polished copper lit by sunset. Its eyes were dark and bright, too knowing for any creature of the air. It shook itself once, scattering sparks or petals or something between the two, and then flew upward through the branches into the night. As it flew, it began to sing. The song was beautiful, but beauty does not prevent a thing from being terrifying. Its voice rang clear as a silver bell and deep as a human cry heard through water. The words told exactly what had happened. My mother killed me. My father ate me. My sister Marlene gathered all my bones, tied them in silk, and laid them beneath the juniper tree. Tweet, tweet, what a beautiful bird am I. The bird flew over the world with its song. First it came to a goldsmith sitting at his bench. The room was warm with lamplight and smelled of hot metal and charcoal. Fine chains glittered on hooks, and the man, bent over his work, heard the bird singing above his shop. The song was so strange and haunting that he rose at once and stepped outside, still wearing his leather apron, one eye still shielded by his little magnifying lens. He looked up and saw the bird in the tree before his door, shining in the half-light like a jewel that had come alive. Bird, said the goldsmith, sing that song again. No, sang the bird, tilting its bright head. I do not sing twice for nothing. Give me the gold chain you have made. The chain the goldsmith had crafted was fine and rich, heavy enough to show wealth, delicate enough to show skill. Yet the bird's song had entered his heart like a hook. Without quite knowing why, he went inside, fetched the chain, and carried it out in both hands. The bird swooped low, seized the chain in one claw, settled again on the branch, and sang the whole terrible song once more. The goldsmith stood beneath it, listening with his mouth slightly open, his face pale by the end. When the song finished, the bird rose, chain glinting from its claw, and flew away. Next it came to a shoemaker and his wife and their children, who sat at supper in their little house. The room smelled of leather, cabbage, and warm bread. The bird's song sounded through the window, and one by one they all rose from their benches, drawn outside by the uncanny music. The mother still held the baby on her hip. The father wiped his hands on his apron. The children stared up wide-eyed. Bird, they said, sing again. No, replied the bird, not for nothing. Give me the red shoes. The shoes were small, exquisitely made, dyed a vivid, deep red like fresh berries crushed into velvet. They belonged to the shoemaker's daughter. Yet, as with the goldsmith, the family felt compelled. The shoes were brought out. The bird took them in its other claw and sang again. My mother killed me. My father ate me. My sister Marlene gathered all my bones, tied them in silk, and laid them beneath the juniper tree. Tweet, tweet, what a beautiful bird am I. When the last note faded, the children shuddered without knowing why, and the bird lifted once more into the sky. Finally, it came to a mill. A mill is a place already full of ghostly sounds. The groaning wheel, the grinding stone, the rain of grain, the constant dull thunder of weight turning against weight. Dust hangs in the air like pale smoke. The men who worked there were bent to their labor, their faces powdered white by flour, so that they seemed almost corpse-like in the dimness. The bird settled on a linden tree near the mill and began to sing. At the first lines, one of the millers stopped to listen. At the next lines, another stopped. Soon one after another they emerged, until only the millstone itself continued its ceaseless turning. They gathered beneath the tree in their white, dusted clothes, their broad shoulders pressed together, their hands still marked by work. Bird, they called, sing it once more. No, said the bird, I do not sing twice for nothing. Give me the millstone. The millers laughed at first, because what creature could carry a millstone? But the desire to hear the song again overcame their reason. Together they heaved the stone, massive and rough, with a hole in the center. It took many men straining shoulder to shoulder, grunting under the weight, to lift it free. They rolled it out beneath the tree. The bird descended. It slipped its neck through the center hole, so that the stone hung there like an enormous collar. Then, chain in one claw and red shoes in the other, it rose into the air, and though it should have been impossible, it flew. It flew back toward the rich man's house, where the juniper tree stood over old buried wishes and newer hidden crimes. Evening had come again by the time it returned. The father sat before the house. There was an unease on him that he could not name. Sometimes guilt travels through a body, even when the mind knows nothing. He felt strangely light and strangely troubled, as though some piece of the world had shifted and not yet settled back. Inside the house, the stepmother moved from room to room with the brittle energy of one whose nerves have begun at last to fray. Her face looked drawn. Every creak of the beams made her flinch. Marlene sat silently in a corner, her eyes swollen from tears. Her little hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles shone white. Then the bird alighted on the juniper tree. It began to sing. The father heard the voice and rose. How beautiful that bird is, he said, and for the first time in many days, warmth touched his heart. And what a splendid song. The stepmother heard it too. At the first line, her blood seemed to stop. At the second, her hands went cold. At the third, she felt as though the room were filling with smoke. She pressed her fingers against her ears, but she could still hear. Sweat broke over her skin. The words of the song struck her like blows. My mother killed me. My father ate me. My sister Marlene gathered all my bones, tied them in silk, and laid them beneath the juniper tree. Tweet, tweet, what a beautiful bird am I. The father stepped into the yard smiling, drawn by the song as though by a promise. The stepmother staggered after him, but each step seemed heavy. Her knees weakened, her sight blurred. She looked up toward the tree, and what she saw there was not a lovely bird, but judgment feathered in color and flame. Little Marlene came too. As she stepped beneath the tree, the bird let fall the red shoes. They dropped neatly before her feet. She stared. They were exactly her size. With the innocent delight that still somehow survived all her grief, she slipped them on. They fit perfectly. Their leather was soft and bright. For the first time since her brother's death, a small smile flickered over her face. The father stood below the branches and said, "I feel so strangely happy. It is as though I am meeting an old friend." Then the bird let fall the gold chain. It descended in a bright arc and settled around the father's neck. He lifted his hands to it in astonishment. It gleamed against his clothes, warm from the air, and a deep contentment came over him, though he did not yet know why. The stepmother looked from the red shoes to the gold chain and understood that something remained for her. A terrible dread seized her. She wanted to run into the house. She wanted to disappear into the earth. But fear held her where she stood. Her face had gone the color of curdled milk. Her eyes were wild. She trembled so violently that the fabric of her dress quivered. Above her, the bird shifted. The millstone slipped. What falls in fairy tales falls with purpose. The stone plunged straight down. It struck the stepmother with a force that broke her utterly. There was a crack like a felled tree splitting on rock. Dust and fragments flew. For an instant, the air filled with a cloud of white powder and dark red spray. The body collapsed beneath the stone, crushed flat, bones shattered, flesh ruined. The skull burst open like fruit dropped from a height. No scream lasted more than a breath. Then there was silence. The dust drifted slowly down. The smell of blood rose into the evening air, mingling with juniper and soil and the bitter scent of the tree. Where the smoke and dust had lifted, where the ruin of the woman had lain, there now stood the little boy, whole, living. His skin was fair. His cheeks were red. His eyes were bright. He looked exactly as he had before death took him, before the chest lid fell, before the pot simmered. He stood beneath the juniper tree beside Marlene and his father, as though he had merely returned from some brief journey. The father stared, unable to speak. Marlene gave a cry, but now it was a cry of joy. She threw herself at her brother. He embraced her. The father sank to his knees and held them both. And there, beneath the old juniper, where his first wife lay buried, where blood had once stained snow, where bones had been laid in silk, the broken family was made whole again, though the shape of that wholeness could never be innocent. Then they all went into the house together. What became of them after that, the old tale tells us only briefly. They sat at table. They ate. They were glad. Yet, if one lingers in the mind of the story, one cannot help imagining the rest. The house would never sound the same again. Every chair would carry memory. The wooden chest in the storeroom would stand like a mute witness until someone chopped it apart for firewood in trembling haste. The kitchen table would remember the knife. The hearth would remember the pot. The floorboards would remember where blood had seeped between them. And the father, however joyful to have his son restored, would live with a horror no resurrection could fully erase. He had eaten of his own child. Even in ignorance, that knowledge would return to him at odd hours. Perhaps while lifting a spoon. Perhaps at the smell of broth. Perhaps in dreams where bones knocked softly beneath the table, and a clear voice sang from the dark garden outside. Little Marlene, too, would carry the memory. Children survive dreadful things, but survival is not forgetting. She would remember the weight of her brother's head in her hands. She would remember the white kerchief and the red shoes and the sound of the millstone falling. Maybe, even years later, she would wake at night reaching for her throat, certain for one terrified instant that it was tied too tight. As for the boy, who can say what remains in one who has been murdered, cooked, sung through a bird's throat, and restored beneath a haunted tree? Old stories do not explain such mysteries. They merely present them. He lived. He returned. But perhaps sometimes, when the wind moved through the juniper branches, he would stop and listen with an expression no one else understood. The juniper tree remained. Through every season, it stood over the place where wish and grief, murder and justice, death and return had all intertwined. In winter, its berries burned red against the snow like the first drops that began the tale. In summer, its fragrance drifted through the garden, bitter and sweet. No one who knew the story could pass beneath it without feeling the air change around them. For trees in old tales are not merely trees. They are witnesses. They keep what the house tries to hide. They hear confessions spoken by no human tongue. They drink from roots sunk deep in grave soil. And now and then, when wrong has been done beneath their branches, they answer. That is what makes the juniper tree so terrible. Not only the murder, not only the cannibal feast, not only the severed head tied in place to deceive a child. It is terrible because it begins with longing and ends with justice. And between those two things, the world reveals how thin the wall is between the cradle and the grave, between the kitchen and the slaughterhouse, between family love and family violence. It reminds us that the most horrifying places are not always castles ruined by curses or forests full of wolves. Sometimes they are homes. Sometimes horror sits at the table and serves supper with a steady hand. And if you imagine, late at night, a house gone quiet after all the lamps are out, and beyond that house, an old juniper tree stirring in the dark though no wind blows, then perhaps you will understand why this story has endured. Because deep down, everyone knows there are griefs that root themselves in the ground and do not stay buried. There are crimes that sing. There are dead children in old tales who do not rest until the truth is spoken aloud in a clear and beautiful voice for all the world to hear. So if ever you see red against white in winter, if ever you smell juniper on a bitter evening, if ever a bird's song sounds almost like words in the dark, think of the woman beneath the tree wishing for a child. Think of the boy as white as snow and red as blood. Think of little Marlene gathering bones in silk. And think, too, of the stepmother standing frozen beneath the branches, while judgment hangs directly over her head. Some stories end happily. This one ends truthfully. A child wronged was remembered. A murder hidden was revealed. A song carried the dead back home. And under the juniper tree, where blood first touched snow, the living and the dead met one another in the old terrible language of fairy tales. That is the end of the juniper tree. If you stayed with me all the way to the last whisper beneath those branches, thank you for listening. I hope this haunting retelling stayed with you in all the best and worst ways. If you want more dark folklore, grim fairy tales, and eerie stories, leave a like and subscribe. Until next time, keep the lights low, keep your ears open, and if you hear singing outside your window after midnight, maybe do not look toward the tree. Good night.
Whispers of a love so true, painting dreams of me and you. And I'll hold you close in this moment so divine. Whispers of